No one told Daniel Harper that before listening closely, he should pause for a moment, reflect on where he was tuning in from, and quietly decide to stay connected. But the thought hovered naturally as his story unfolded, because this was the kind of account that invited participation without demanding it. Daniel arrived in the Philippines expecting chaos masked by smiles, convinced that daily order was a luxury reserved for wealthier nations. What he encountered instead unsettled him from the first morning. Streets were swept before sunrise, shoes aligned neatly outside modest homes, and routines followed with calm precision. This was not staged, not ceremonial, and not performed for visitors. It was ordinary life. The shock did not come from perfection but from consistency. Daniel sensed immediately that what he was witnessing challenged something deeper than stereotypes. It challenged assumptions he had carried unconsciously for years. And once that realization took hold, there was no comfortable way to look away. Daniel's expectations had been shaped long before he booked his flight. He had absorbed stories, headlines, and passing remarks that framed developing nations as places where order struggled to survive. Friends warned him about disorder disguised as hospitality. Travel forums emphasized survival tips rather than understanding. Daniel did not consider himself arrogant, only practical, yet practicality often hides prejudice beneath caution. When he stepped into his rented neighborhood, he expected noise, clutter, and improvisation bordering on neglect. Instead, he noticed repetition. Trash was sorted. Pathways were cleared daily. Small storefronts arranged goods with care despite limited space. Nothing screamed discipline, yet everything reflected it. Daniel found himself watching quietly, as if the environment contradicted an internal script he did not remember writing. The discomfort was subtle but persistent. Tidiness here was not a performance for tourists. It was a shared agreement embedded in routine, and that realization unsettled him more than disorder ever could. The shock deepened when Daniel spent time inside homes. These were not luxury residences, yet every item seemed to have a place. Floors were swept multiple times a day. Dishes were washed immediately after meals. Children returned toys without instruction. Daniel waited for signs of strain or compulsion, assuming cleanliness required pressure. Instead, he saw ease. Tidiness flowed naturally, as if woven into daily rhythm rather than enforced by rules. He remembered growing up in America where clutter accumulated despite abundance, where convenience excused neglect. The contrast embarrassed him. These households did not possess excess space or resources, yet they maintained order without complaint. Daniel realized that tidiness here was not about appearance, but respect. Respect for shared space, for neighbors, and for oneself. That realization unsettled him deeply because it suggested that order was not a product of wealth, but of values cultivated quietly over generations. Daniel began asking questions, careful not to sound judgmental. The answers surprised him. People spoke of cleanliness as courtesy, not discipline. They described tidiness as a way to reduce stress, maintain harmony, and show care for others. No one framed it as moral superiority. It was simply normal. Daniel compared this with conversations back home, where cleanliness often became a burden or an obligation. Here, it was invisible because it was constant. Streets reflected collective effort, rather than municipal enforcement. Neighbors cleaned areas beyond their property lines without expecting recognition. Daniel struggled to reconcile this with narratives he had accepted unquestioningly. He realized that he had equated informality with disorder, friendliness with lax standards. The Philippines quietly disproved that equation. What unsettled him most was how unremarkable everyone found this way of living. They did not see themselves as tidy people. They saw themselves as considerate people, and tidiness was merely evidence of that consideration. As days passed, Daniel noticed how this everyday order influenced behavior. Disputes were fewer. Shared spaces felt calmer. Even crowded areas carried a sense of flow rather than friction. He realized tidiness functioned as social glue, reducing tension before it could escalate. Back home, He had accepted disorder as background noise, something to manage rather than prevent. Here, prevention was built into routine. Daniel reflected on how environments shape attitudes subtly. When spaces are respected, people tend to respect one another. This insight unsettled him because it implicated his own habits. He had blamed stress, work, and time scarcity for clutter without questioning priorities. Watching Filipinos maintain order amid limited resources dismantled those excuses. The story he told himself about modern life felt increasingly hollow. What he was witnessing was not cultural rigidity but cultural mindfulness, practiced quietly without slogans or instruction manuals, sustained by shared understanding rather than enforcement. Daniel's shock evolved into curiosity, then humility. He began participating in routines instead of observing them. He swept floors without being asked, washed dishes immediately, arranged items deliberately. No one praised him. No one corrected him. His efforts were simply absorbed into the flow. That lack of attention surprised him. Back home, cleanliness often invited commentary or judgment. Here, it was expected but not scrutinized. Daniel felt strangely relieved. Order existed without performance. This experience shifted his understanding of discipline. Discipline here was not rigid or authoritarian. It was gentle, habitual, and shared. He recognized how American culture often associates order with control, while Filipino culture associated it with care. That distinction mattered. One coerces compliance, the other encourages participation. Daniel sensed that his shock stemmed from encountering a value system he had not been taught to recognize. The Philippines had not changed itself for him. It had simply revealed what he had overlooked. Conversations with elders deepened Daniel's understanding. They spoke of upbringings centered on awareness rather than instruction. Children learned by observing adults, not through constant correction. Cleanliness was modeled, not demanded. Daniel thought of his own childhood filled with reminders and reprimands. The difference was striking. Here, behavior flowed from environment. If surroundings were kept orderly, children absorbed that order instinctively. Daniel realized that culture shapes habits long before rules intervene. This realization unsettled him because it challenged his belief in individual discipline as primary driver. Collective practice mattered more. Tidiness was sustained because everyone participated, not because someone enforced it. Daniel wondered how different his own community might feel if order was treated as shared responsibility rather than personal burden. The Philippines presented an alternative vision quietly, without critique. That silence was powerful. It forced Daniel to confront assumptions without defensiveness, because no one was trying to prove anything to him. As weeks passed, Daniel's initial shock transformed into reflection. He noticed how his mood improved in orderly spaces. Stress diminished. Focus sharpened. He felt lighter, as if external order created internal clarity. This was not something he expected from observing daily routines. He had always considered cleanliness functional, not emotional. Yet here, the connection was undeniable. Tidiness functioned as emotional regulation. Daniel began questioning how much anxiety in his own life stemmed from normalized chaos. He remembered dismissing clutter as harmless. Now it felt like noise he had learned to ignore. The Philippines did not preach mindfulness, yet it practiced it through action. Daniel realized that the shock he experienced was not about Filipinos being tidy. It was about discovering how untidy his own assumptions had been. The story unfolding was less about cultural difference and more about personal awakening triggered by everyday behavior he once overlooked. Daniel started documenting his observations privately, not for publication but for understanding. Patterns emerged. Tidiness was linked to respect for time. Tasks were completed promptly to prevent accumulation. Small efforts prevented large problems. This philosophy extended beyond cleaning into communication, planning, and relationships. Daniel recognized a broader cultural principle: address issues early, quietly, and collectively. Back home, problems often escalated because they were postponed. Here, prevention was ingrained. This realization unsettled Daniel because it suggested inefficiency was not inevitable. It was learned. The Philippines challenged narratives that framed certain societies as inherently disorganized. Daniel saw discipline expressed without severity, order maintained without obsession. This balance fascinated him. It contradicted extremes he was accustomed to, where cleanliness either became compulsion or collapsed into neglect. The Filipino approach occupied a middle ground sustained by shared values rather than individual perfectionism. That middle ground felt surprisingly powerful and deeply instructive. When Daniel shared his observations with friends back home, reactions varied. Some dismissed his experience as selective perception. Others accused him of romanticizing poverty. These responses unsettled him further. He realized how difficult it was to challenge entrenched narratives. Yet he knew what he had seen repeatedly, across neighborhoods and contexts. Tidiness here was not about impressing outsiders. It was internalized. Daniel reflected on why this reality threatened assumptions. Perhaps it disrupted hierarchies that equated wealth with discipline. The idea that order could thrive without excess unsettled economic narratives. Daniel understood that his shock was part of a larger discomfort experienced when stereotypes collapse. The Philippines did not fit neatly into simplified frameworks. Its everyday tidiness exposed complexity often ignored. Daniel felt responsibility to speak honestly, even if uncomfortable. The story he was living was not extraordinary in the Philippines, but it was extraordinary to him, precisely because it dismantled beliefs he had never examined critically. Daniel noticed how tidiness influenced hospitality. Guests were welcomed into clean spaces without anxiety. There was no frantic preparation or apology. Order existed before arrival. This contrasted with his experiences where hosting involved stress and last-minute cleaning. Here, hospitality felt relaxed because readiness was constant. Daniel recognized how this affected social relationships. People gathered more freely when spaces were maintained. Community interactions flourished. Tidiness facilitated connection rather than restricting it. This insight challenged his assumption that order required sacrifice. Instead, it created ease. The Philippines demonstrated how discipline could support warmth rather than suppress it. Daniel reflected on how often Americans framed cleanliness as work rather than care. This framing shaped attitudes negatively. Observing Filipino households reframed order as kindness extended to others. That reframing unsettled Daniel because it revealed how language influences behavior. When cleanliness is framed as care, participation increases naturally. The story unfolding was teaching him quietly, without instruction, through lived example. The longer Daniel stayed, the more he recognized his shock as layered. It was not merely surprise at cleanliness but recognition of misjudgment. He had arrived with assumptions that filtered perception. Tidiness disrupted those filters. Daniel realized that prejudice often hides in expectations rather than opinions. He had expected disorder, so order shocked him. This realization humbled him deeply. The Philippines did not demand apology or acknowledgement. It simply existed as it was. That passive correction felt more powerful than confrontation. Daniel thought about how often defensiveness arises when challenged directly. Here, challenge occurred indirectly through experience. He could not argue with what he saw daily. This method of learning felt gentler yet more enduring. Daniel understood that his shock marked the beginning of unlearning rather than learning. He had to dismantle internal narratives before appreciating external reality fully. The story became introspective, reshaping his understanding of culture, respect, and responsibility quietly over time. Daniel began to see tidiness as a form of dignity. Maintaining clean spaces despite limited resources communicated self-respect without arrogance. It rejected pity narratives often imposed by outsiders. This dignity unsettled Daniel because it resisted categorization. The Philippines was not trying to prove anything. It simply functioned according to its values. Daniel compared this with environments where excess coexisted with neglect. Wealth did not guarantee order, It often complicated it. The Filipino approach simplified life through routine and care. Daniel realized that this simplicity was misunderstood as primitiveness by those who equated complexity with advancement. His shock evolved into admiration grounded in respect rather than novelty. The story unfolding no longer felt like discovery of something exotic. It felt like rediscovery of something fundamental. Cleanliness as care. Order as respect. Discipline as shared responsibility. These principles transcended geography, yet the Philippines embodied them in everyday practice with quiet consistency. Daniel's perception of time shifted. Tasks were completed promptly not because of urgency, but because delay created disorder. This proactive approach contrasted with his habit of postponement. He realized how much mental energy he spent managing accumulated tasks. Here, tasks dissolved quickly, preventing buildup. Tidiness extended beyond physical spaces into schedules and communication. Appointments were respected. Messages were answered. Responsibilities were acknowledged. Daniel felt lighter participating in this rhythm. The shock came from realizing how much unnecessary stress he had normalized. The Philippines revealed an alternative pace that was neither rushed nor chaotic. It was steady. This steadiness unsettled Daniel because it contradicted narratives that equated productivity with constant urgency. Here, productivity emerged from consistency rather than pressure. Daniel began to internalize this lesson, recognizing its broader implications for well-being. The story expanded beyond tidiness into philosophy of living shaped by small, repeated acts of care and attention. As Daniel prepared to leave, he reflected on how deeply his expectations had shifted. The shock he felt initially had matured into gratitude. He understood now that tidiness in the Philippines was not about cleanliness alone. It was about social harmony, mutual respect, and emotional regulation. These values were practiced quietly, without slogans or campaigns. Daniel realized that his culture often sought solutions through innovation while overlooking habits. The Philippines demonstrated how habits shape outcomes sustainably. This insight unsettled him because it suggested change did not always require transformation, only consistency. Daniel felt responsible to carry this understanding forward. The story he would share was not about Filipinos being unusually tidy. It was about recognizing dignity and discipline where others expected disorder. His shock had been a mirror reflecting his own assumptions. And once seen clearly, that reflection could not be ignored or forgotten easily. Back home, Daniel struggled to articulate his experience without sounding preachy. He noticed resistance when he described everyday tidiness abroad. People defended their environments instinctively. Daniel recognized himself in their reactions. He chose instead to share stories without judgment. He described how habits shaped mood, how order reduced stress, how care replaced enforcement. Slowly, conversations shifted. Some listened. Others dismissed. Daniel accepted that transformation requires readiness. The Philippines had not tried to change him. It simply existed. That authenticity made impact possible. Daniel realized that shock alone does not teach. Reflection does. His story became quieter, more deliberate. He spoke less about difference and more about possibility. The lesson was not that Filipinos were better, but that assumptions were flawed. This distinction mattered. It preserved respect. Daniel's journey became one of unlearning arrogance disguised as practicality. That unlearning was ongoing, uncomfortable, yet necessary for genuine understanding. Daniel began applying lessons consciously. He reorganized his living space, not obsessively but thoughtfully. He completed tasks promptly. He noticed reduced anxiety. Friends commented on his calmness. Daniel smiled privately, aware that change had occurred without dramatic effort. He credited the Philippines not as ideal, but as teacher through example. The shock he experienced had evolved into habit formation. This progression fascinated him. Cultural exposure reshaped behavior subtly, without instruction. Daniel realized how environments educate continuously. This understanding unsettled him because it implied responsibility. If environments shape people, then neglect perpetuates dysfunction. The Philippines demonstrated how collective effort sustains order organically. Daniel wondered how different communities might feel if small acts of care were normalized. The story he carried was not a critique, but an invitation to reconsider what was possible when order was treated as kindness rather than contro. Over time, Daniel noticed how his language changed. He stopped using phrases that implied disorder as inevitable. He reframed conversations around shared responsibility. This linguistic shift reflected deeper transformation. Words influence perception, and perception influences behavior. The Philippines had taught him that without saying a word. Daniel recognized how often narratives about other cultures relied on simplification. Tidiness disrupted those narratives. It required nuance. Daniel accepted that nuance rarely goes viral, yet it matters. His story did not rely on shock value anymore. It relied on honesty. The initial shock had served its purpose, opening his awareness. What followed was sustained respect. Daniel understood that lasting change begins quietly, through consistent exposure to alternative ways of living. The Philippines did not demand recognition. Its everyday practices spoke louder than defense or explanation. Daniel carried that lesson forward, mindful of how easily assumptions distort understanding. Daniel realized that his shock had been rooted in imbalance of information. He had learned more about what the Philippines lacked than what it practiced. Tidiness exposed that imbalance. It revealed competence overlooked. This realization unsettled him because it suggested systemic bias in storytelling. Certain narratives dominated because they reinforced hierarchies. The Philippines disrupted those hierarchies quietly. Daniel reflected on how respect is often withheld until granted by external validation. Here, respect was self-generated through daily action. This autonomy impressed him deeply. It reframed his understanding of dignity as independent of recognition. Daniel felt humbled by how much he had overlooked. The story he experienced became a lesson in listening rather than judging. Tidiness was simply the entry point. Beneath it lay values that sustained communities without fanfare. Daniel understood that acknowledging this reality required humility. And humility, once awakened, demanded ongoing self-examination. As months passed, Daniel noticed that his shock no longer carried intensity. It had settled into appreciation. He realized that meaningful experiences do not remain dramatic. They integrate quietly into worldview. The Philippines had done that. Tidiness was no longer surprising, it was instructive. Daniel accepted that initial shock was necessary to disrupt complacency. Without it, he might not have paid attention. The story evolved from surprise to understanding. He no longer framed Filipinos as tidy people. He framed them as people who valued care in everyday life. That framing mattered. It avoided exoticizing and preserved respect. Daniel recognized that the most powerful cultural lessons are those that appear ordinary to insiders. Outsiders only recognize their significance when assumptions collapse. His journey illustrated that collapse gently. The Philippines did not challenge him aggressively. It simply lived differently, and that difference spoke volumes. Daniel began encouraging others to travel with curiosity rather than expectation. He shared his experience as cautionary tale about assumptions. Tidiness became metaphor for unseen strengths. He explained how everyday practices reveal values more accurately than statistics. Some listened skeptically. Others nodded thoughtfully. Daniel understood that perspective shifts occur gradually. His responsibility was not persuasion but honesty. The story he told resisted sensationalism. It emphasized routine over revelation. This restraint preserved integrity. Daniel realized that shock-driven narratives fade quickly, while reflective ones endure. The Philippines deserved enduring understanding rather than fleeting surprise. Tidiness was one expression of deeper cultural coherence. Daniel hoped that by sharing his story thoughtfully, others might approach unfamiliar cultures with humility. His shock had been personal, but its lesson was universal. Respect begins where assumptions end. And sometimes the most transformative lessons are taught without intention, through everyday acts repeated quietly across generations. Daniel reflected on how his shock might have appeared to Filipinos if expressed openly. He recognized that framing matters. Surprise can unintentionally imply low expectations. This awareness made him cautious. He chose language that centered learning rather than astonishment. The Philippines had taught him not only about tidiness but about communication. Respect required sensitivity. Daniel appreciated how locals never corrected his assumptions verbally. They allowed experience to speak. This patience impressed him. It demonstrated confidence without defensiveness. Daniel realized that true cultural strength does not seek validation. It simply exists. Tidiness functioned as quiet assertion of values. This realization unsettled him because it challenged performative narratives he was accustomed to. The Philippines did not need to prove orderliness. It practiced it. That distinction was profound. Daniel's story matured into reflection on humility, learning, and the ethics of observation across cultures. As Daniel continued sharing his experience, he noticed a pattern. People were more receptive when he spoke about his own assumptions rather than others' behavior. This approach shifted focus inward. Tidiness became mirror rather than spectacle. Daniel understood that change begins with self-awareness. The Philippines had triggered that awareness by contradicting his expectations. The shock had been necessary but insufficient. Reflection completed the process. Daniel realized how often societies resist critique because it feels external. Internal realization bypasses that resistance. The Philippines offered that gift indirectly. Daniel appreciated this subtle pedagogy. It respected autonomy. He began applying similar approach in his own interactions, modeling behaviors rather than lecturing. This practice felt more authentic. The story he carried became quieter but more impactful. It was no longer about Filipinos surprising Americans. It was about Americans reconsidering themselves through exposure to alternative everyday value. Daniel acknowledged that tidiness alone does not define a culture. He avoided reducing the Philippines to a single trait. Yet he recognized its symbolic power. Tidiness represented deeper commitments to care, respect, and community. These values manifested in many ways. Daniel observed kindness, patience, and resilience intertwined with order. This holistic understanding replaced initial shock with balanced appreciation. He realized that stereotypes often collapse complexity into deficiency. The Philippines demonstrated complexity without apology. Daniel felt gratitude for being allowed to witness that reality. His story evolved into testimony of learning rather than judgment. He emphasized that travel should expand perspective, not confirm bias. The shock he felt became a reminder of how easily assumptions form. By sharing his experience thoughtfully, Daniel hoped to encourage more mindful engagement with unfamiliar cultures. The lesson extended beyond geography into how people approach difference with openness rather than expectation. Daniel's journey taught him that everyday practices hold profound meaning. Tidiness was not trivial. It shaped relationships, environments, and mental states. The Philippines demonstrated how small acts accumulate into social stability. This insight unsettled Daniel because it suggested that many problems labeled complex stem from neglected basics. He reflected on how societies chase grand solutions while ignoring daily habits. The Philippines quietly contradicted that approach. Order emerged from repetition, not reform. Daniel recognized this as transferable wisdom. It applied anywhere willing to practice it. His shock had been gateway to understanding that progress does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it sweeps floors, aligns shoes, and clears pathways daily. That simplicity was powerful. Daniel carried this realization forward, aware that its strength lay in consistency rather than novelty. The story he lived became one of rediscovering fundamentals overlooked in pursuit of complexity. Daniel noticed how his appreciation deepened over time rather than fading. This longevity distinguished meaningful experiences from fleeting impressions. The Philippines had altered his baseline expectations. He no longer equated informality with disorder. He recognized order in places previously dismissed. This recalibration affected how he viewed the world. Daniel became more observant, less judgmental. He credited the Philippines for this shift. Tidiness had been the catalyst, but humility sustained transformation. Daniel understood that shock is temporary, but reflection endures. His story exemplified that progression. He shared it not as revelation but as reminder that learning often occurs quietly. The Philippines did not advertise its values. It lived them. Daniel's role was simply to notice and learn. This awareness carried responsibility. He committed to honoring that lesson by questioning assumptions wherever they arose, understanding that true respect begins with attention. Daniel reflected on how easily cultures are misunderstood when viewed through limited lenses. Tidiness challenged one lens but illuminated many others. It revealed discipline without severity, order without rigidity, and care without performance. These nuances mattered. Daniel recognized that his shock had been shaped by incomplete narratives. By witnessing everyday life, he accessed fuller understanding. This experience reinforced belief that proximity dissolves prejudice more effectively than debate. The Philippines offered proximity through ordinary routines. Daniel valued that gift deeply. His story became affirmation of experiential learning. It reminded him that assumptions persist when unchallenged. The shock he felt signaled the moment challenge occurred. What followed was growth. Daniel embraced that growth, acknowledging its discomfort. He understood that being wrong was not failure but opportunity. The Philippines provided that opportunity generously, without expectation, through the quiet dignity of everyday tidiness practiced collectively. As Daniel continued integrating lessons, he noticed greater patience in himself. Order fostered calm. Calm fostered empathy. This chain reaction fascinated him. The Philippines demonstrated how environment influences character subtly. Daniel applied this insight beyond cleanliness, considering how social systems shape behavior. He recognized parallels in communication, conflict resolution, and cooperation. Tidiness symbolized intentionality. It showed how deliberate choices accumulate. Daniel's shock had expanded into systems thinking. He appreciated how culture operates through repetition rather than instruction. This realization reshaped his understanding of change. He no longer sought dramatic interventions. He valued steady practice. The Philippines had taught him that transformation is often invisible until accumulated. This lesson resonated deeply. Daniel carried it forward with gratitude, aware that its simplicity made it easy to overlook, but powerful when embraced consistently. Daniel understood that his story would resonate differently with different audiences. Some would dismiss it, others would reflect. He accepted that outcome. His role was not to convince, but to share honestly. Tidiness served as entry point to deeper conversation about values and assumptions. The Philippines offered that conversation without words. Daniel respected that restraint. He avoided sensational framing, choosing sincerity instead. This approach honored the culture that taught him quietly. His shock had been internal, his expression needed humility. Daniel recognized that respect requires careful storytelling. He framed his experience as learning rather than discovery. This distinction preserved dignity. The story concluded not with conclusion but continuation. Daniel's understanding remained evolving. The Philippines had altered his trajectory subtly but permanently, reminding him that everyday practices often carry wisdom overlooked by those searching only for spectacle. In the end, Daniel no longer described himself as shocked. He described himself as corrected. The Philippines had not surprised him. It had clarified reality obscured by assumption. Everyday tidiness revealed deeper truths about care, respect, and community practiced quietly. This understanding reshaped his worldview. The story he carried forward invited reflection rather than applause. It suggested that meaningful lessons often arrive unannounced, through routines rather than revelations. Daniel recognized that the most enduring insights come from observing how people live when no one is watching. The Philippines embodied that authenticity. His journey illustrated how humility begins when expectations dissolve. The narrative did not end with admiration but with responsibility to see others clearly. Wherever this story is heard, its relevance persists. It reminds listeners that assumptions distort, attention reveals, and everyday actions often carry the deepest wisdom when approached with openness.